Hello guys and welcome to this YouTube video. In this YouTube video I will talk about what is actually going on between Russia and Ukraine and how this political conflict there is impacting the stock markets. Before I get into the video, I want to make a quick disclaimer and say that I'm not talking about any of the political stuff that's going on. I'm only going to talk about the events that has occurred in this conflict there is, and then I'm going to talk about how they have impacted the financial markets and what the financial impacts of this potentially could be. So with that being said, then let's start the video. The first thing that I want to talk about is the ruble, which is basically the native currency in Russia. When you're looking at the development of the ruble in the last 24 hours, you're able to see that in comparison to the US dollar, the ruble actually decreased by 15% in value, which is a lot. But now it gets really interesting when you're looking at the ruble's development over the last couple of weeks, because you're basically able to see that there's not really a lot of things happening with the ruble. This is actually an indication that the stock market did not expect this to happen. They did not expect that this invasion in Ukraine would happen. So basically there has been an unexpected event to the stock markets, and as with all unexpected events in the stock market reacts negatively. And they also did that today. When you're looking at the S&P 500 index, you're basically able to see that it is estimated that this index is going to open at roughly minus 2% today, which is also a pretty high negative return. But by itself, it might not sound like a lot, but if you're taking into comparison the development of the S&P 500 index just in this year, then another 2% on top of that is actually a lot. When you're looking at the largest index in Russia, you're also able to see that it dropped more than 30% within the last 24 hours, which is an enormous hit to the index. So Russia is also heavily impacted by what is actually going on right now. If you look at all of the other European indexes, you're basically able to see that they're also falling by roughly 3 to 6%, depending on what country it is. So in general, right now, we can say that the negative returns are a bit higher in Europe than they are in the US. But it is very early to say what is going to happen. So overall, it is very safe to say that what happens between Russia and Ukraine does have an impact on the financial markets, and it does have an impact on the financials for the rest of the world, basically. We've already had a very rough beginning to the year, but this could potentially make it even worse for us for the rest of 2022 and maybe even also 2023. But right now I'm going to talk about what the rest of the world could actually do against Russia, and how these things that they can do and that they're talking about doing could affect the economy as well. One of the things that can be done against Russia and that the politicians that they're talking about right now is excluding Russia from something known as the SWIFT system. The SWIFT system is basically a system that verifies and makes you able to transfer money automatically. So basically all online money transfers, they are authorized by this system. And if they do exclude Russia from the system, well then it becomes very hard for Russians to transfer money. And this does of course have an impact, not only on the government in Russia, but also on all of the companies in Russia and also the people living in Russia. So that is one of the things that can be done and that they're talking about doing to Russia that does have an impact on their economy. Another thing that can happen, and that some financial institutions are already starting to talk about, is excluding Russian companies from their trading platforms, which basically means that you're not able to buy stocks in Russian companies anymore. It also means that hedge funds and other large corporations that hold a large portfolio, they have to sell out all of their holdings in Russian-based companies, and this does also have an impact on the returns and so on. They're also talking about making a rule that says that companies are not able to sell their services and goods to Russia. This does have a massive impact on companies that are heavily reliant on Russia. This could be a bunch of European companies, for example, but also US-based companies have a huge amount of sales in Russia. And if they're not able to sell their products in Russia, well then their earnings does decrease and they have some problems there. I know that a lot of European companies, they also have factories based in Russia. And for those, there might be some complications as well. So basically, this whole situation does have an impact on companies that is not only placed in Russia and not only placed in Europe, but also in the US and all other parts of the world. because we are so heavily connected. Another very negative thing about this situation is that whenever there is a conflict like this between two countries, then it usually results in an increase in government spending. Right now in the US, we have an inflation of roughly 7.5%. I don't really see how they're able to keep the inflation at this level if this is to evolve even further. I do personally think that we could potentially see an increase in the inflation. Right now, the Fed are doing whatever they can to hold the inflation down, and they're doing that by increasing interest rates. However, if the inflation increases more than what it already has, well then increasing interest rates might not be enough to hold the inflation down, and that is when we get into some real troubles. So basically, the way I see it, there are three major effects of what is going on. One of them is the SWIFT system and making companies sort of like not able to sell their products and services in Russia, but also the whole sort of like inflation part of it, where the government increases their spending. Because we are in a situation right now where we are sort of like on a fine line between being able to reduce the inflation or going into a recession. And this sort of like tips the scale a bit towards the recession, which of course isn't a good thing if you are an investor. What I personally think will happen is that I don't really see how the Fed are going to be able to hold the inflation down with what is going on right now. I personally think that we might see a recession in 2022 or in 2023 unless they find some sort of a way to make this work. It could also be that Russia comes to some sort of an agreement with the European countries or with the US or whomever it is, and this conflict sort of like stops. That would be the best case scenario, of course. But whether that's going to happen or not is something that I'm not really capable of saying. But all in all, it is very safe to say that the situation that there is going on between Russia and Ukraine does have a huge impact on investors, and it does have a huge impact on the financial markets across the world, and that the chances of, or the possibilities of a recession in 2022 or 23 have just increased again. So overall, the situation is not looking very good. I hope that you learned something from watching this video. If you did, then please leave a comment below. Write what you're going to think will happen with this situation. Like the video and subscribe to my channel if you want to. Thank you for watching.